It was a classic small town America. We had the movie theater, we had a couple of restaurants, we had a Western Auto. And in those days, it was old time Huron. There were houses all along Main Street. Main Street at that time was one straight road from the railroad tracks down to the water.
It was just a small town that you felt safe. The community was a safe community. And things seemed, I don't know, easy back then. Life was fun.
Huron was a terrific town. It was the center of a lot of industry at the time. It was really a vibrant town.
And there isn't any question about it. It was quaint, it was charming. It was really what we set out to recreate in terms of the urban renewal area.
The city continued to grow in the early 1960s. New industry like DuPont and Glidden built facilities south of town in Huron Township. And the established businesses like the ore, coal, and grain docks, commercial fishing, marinas, and tourism were attracting more and more people to Huron. A new high school had recently been built, and the city's school system was considered one of the best in the area.
Huron became a city in 1960, and it truly was a village, but to become a city was a big jump for the city of Huron. Well, as it moved into the 65 and they hired Dean Sheldon as their first city manager, was sort of a man of dreams. He wasn't all negative. His dream was that the city become a model city. And if you look at Main Street, the only decent building on Main Street was the funeral home. So the rest of the buildings were quite decrepit. It was a combination of small little restaurants and mainly bars. I think at one time there was like 7 bars on Main Street.
There was no interest in profound upkeep of these properties. Many of them were unsafe. Electrically, the utilities, all of them were in poor shape. The construction of the buildings was deteriorating.
Frankly, we had rats in the second-story garrets, attics of some of the buildings, and this was unacceptable in many ways, of course.
I mean, there were buildings down there where you couldn't go up on the second floor and walk around safely. I remember the dime store had a big sheet of metal. I think it was a sign. And if you wanted to go from here to there on the second floor, you pushed that in front of you so that you wouldn't fall through the ceiling. I mean, it was that kind of thing. And for whatever reason, reluctance on the people of the part of the property owners to make the necessary corrections to make the building safe. And finally, the Chamber of Commerce came to the City Council and said, we got to do something about this downtown.
The Huron Chamber of Commerce and a group of businessmen from the downtown area in Huron came to the city and asked them to please assist them with a new federal program that was coming out, which was the Urban Renewal Program.
And so I was commissioned as the city manager to take that project on. And I'd had considerable experience in that field. And we set about the task that was given to us.
To me, and to many people at the time, the biggest surprise was that this urban renewal money, which amounted to about $3 to $4 million from the federal government, was coming to a town of Huron size and nature instead of to the urban inner city, which is what urban renewal was developed for. Time and time again, I can recall people saying, why on earth would a town like Huron be getting millions of dollars from the federal government to tear it down and rebuild it when the inner city ghettos needed housing and schools, et cetera? It was a real misapplication, I think, of federal funds.
But I think it's important to understand that this project was not generated by me, nor was it generated by the city council, except from a legal standpoint. The call for the improvement of the central business district of Huron came from the people who lived in the community and who had a specific interest in the downtown, and more specifically the Chamber of Commerce itself.
The city manager looked into different things, and we hired Barton and Ashman out of Chicago to put together a plan for the renewal of the downtown.
The original area targeted for redevelopment included the downtown business district from Shirley and Mill Street to South Street. The area was expanded to include the City Hall block bounded by Shirley, Williams, and Main Streets and Route 2, as well as 3 parcels that included the bowling alley and the Twine House. The plan called for the demolition of 57 businesses and 21 residences on Main and William Street. It would cost a little more than $1 million to buy the land and the buildings. Of the 26 acres to be raised, only 19 were to be developed. City officials also wanted to build a 120-berth boat basin, circular in shape, which would serve as a harbor of refuge for small boats forced off the lake by bad weather and provide short-term dockage for boaters visiting Huron.
Very interesting the way they put the funding together. The project was projected to cost about $4 million, as I recall. The federal government was willing to fund 3/4 of it, or about $3 million. So that left the city short $1 million. They went to the state of Ohio and learned that if they would build what's called a harbor of refuge in the town, that they could get state funding for that. And that's what gave rise to the idea for the boat basin. And so the extra $1 million that they needed to fund the whole project, 3/4 of that came from the state for the boat basin. So now they had the $3 million plus about 3/4 of the rest of the million, the next $1 million. They needed another 0.25%, and in my research I found that they had sold many years ago the Huron Light Plant, and they had a fund of money sitting in a capital improvements fund. So they took that money and threw that into the pot, and then there was a little bit left over, and I think they intended to pass a small levy to collect the rest of the money.
The financial plan that we put together for this was extraordinary in that it involved the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, the Division of Watercraft. They paid for the boat basin, and the Corps of Engineers did the widening of the harbor, and so it all worked together so that the city's monetary contribution toward the project was minimal, I would say.
Urban Renewal paid not only for the demolition, but also for the construction of the new roads, the water lines, the storm drains, and etc. But there was no money for redevelopment.
Of course, there were opponents. This is a hot topic in town at the time, and one of the arch rivals of urban renewal was Mrs. Millicent Lieb and her husband, Don. Don had a pest control service in the city, and the two of them were spearheading the opposition to that. She attended almost every council meeting and read a prepared statement against urban renewal. She would hand out books which she purchased to each council person, and one was the federal bulldozer. I don't know if any of the council read them, but she passed them out, made sure everybody got one. She became a nuisance. She had a cause, but the way she went about it, people were laughing at her.
Do you remember a woman named Millie?
Oh, of course I do. Sure I do.
Do you have any comment on that? Yeah, describe what that was all about.
Well, that's a big order. Why don't you rewind the film and we'll start all over again? I don't know what it was all about. Except that she was opposed to this project and a lot of other ones as well. And so I never had any problems with her directly. I mean, I never considered. I thought it was unfortunate that she and a group of cohorts took the attitude that they did with regard to the hard work that we were doing, but I never talked to her about it. I never accosted her. We were on the friendliest of terms, and I thought.
She didn't feel that it was necessary for our downtown to be torn apart, and it was fine the way it was. I think another agenda she might have had was that with my grandfather's business and pest control, all of those businesses were his customers, and they didn't want that to be, interfered with. I do believe she fought for a cause that she strongly believed in, but again, her perspective and her presentation was offensive to many people, and unfortunately, that a lot of what she said went unheard or dismissed because she just couldn't get her point across without making it uncomfortable for a lot of people that may not have agreed with what she said.
Did she have supporters, people that were helping her with all this, or was she pretty much a one-woman?
She was pretty much a one-woman show. I don't recall her having any assistants. I mean, she researched things all the time, always researched.
In particular, probably the most shocking and surprising thing about urban renewal is that it was passed by Huron City Council on what's known as an emergency ordinance.
The use of the emergency ordinance clause was controversial in itself. Emergency ordinances are to be passed only, quote, in order to meet an emergency in the operation of the government or which is necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, health, safety, morals, and public welfare. 2 public hearings were held on the proposed urban renewal plan. Urban Renewal Director Larry Fleming and City Manager Dean Sheldon made a number of presentations to city groups praising its benefits. Because public hearings were held, Mayor Pat Joffrey and a majority of council members decided that the urban renewal project did not need to be placed on a ballot. They said that everyone would have an opportunity to give their views on urban renewal at the hearings. The City Council planned to push the project ahead by emergency ordinance. According to Joffrey, using the emergency ordinance would be the only way City Council could go ahead with the project without a long delay. City Council voted to do just that on July 14, 1967.
Why on earth this development project that tore down the entire city of Huron, dug out the heart of the city to create the boat basin, was passed on an emergency basis, still resonates as a question today. It's quite shocking as a force of government. Millicent Lee went out with a petition drive very quickly, got enough signatures on the petition to have a vote for the repeal take place. And then there was a battle. There was a lot of talking to community groups back and forth, and it was quite a controversial issue. The newspaper was full of the pros and cons.
At the time, Dr. Henry Lair was running for council, and he put out a a brochure called The Truth on Urban Renewal, tour booklet. And he explained the different things that would happen and why it was such a good project. In fact, I have the cover of one of his brochures is showing how dilapidated the town was, and on the back was how to, what the issue was on the ballot.
The city fathers, I remember talking to them, they were quite confident that the vote would pass in favor of urban renewal, something like 2-1. And shockingly, on the night of the election, it did pass, but only by 44 votes, which shocked the city managers by the narrowness of the victory and gave Millicent Lee a huge boost that she'd been so close. One of the minor quirks of that election, and Millicent Lee went to her grave thinking this was a huge travesty, was that because the vote was for a repeal of the urban renewal, you had to vote yes to repeal it and no to keep it. So Millicent got a lot of phone calls, she told me afterwards, by people in tears saying they had gone in thinking if they voted no, they'd be voting no on the urban renewal project, when in fact they were voting no to repeal it, and therefore they were voting the opposite way of the way they intended. So Millicent got another recall petition together and challenged the vote in the local Common Pleas Court in Sandusky. She lost that decision, appealed it to the district appeal court in Toledo, and by a 2-1 vote, she lost again. Meanwhile, she had written to President Johnson and the head of the Urban Renewal Division and said, I've challenged these cases, this project in court, and I would ask you, I beseech you, President Johnson, to halt the urban renewal project until we get a decision from the court. And she did get a letter back from the head of urban renewal saying that President Johnson had spoken to him and had told him to halt the program until the court decision had been reached. As I said, then and that was a huge victory for her, was shocking again to the city managers. And so she was able to proceed with her appeal until she got to the Toledo appeals level court, where she lost. And at that point, the officials flew to Washington, and they made the argument that, look, enough is enough. She's lost 2 levels of appeal, and let's move forward. And in fact, they did then agree to go forward and sign the contract. So Millicent never did get her final ability to challenge this in the court.
Maybe if you could just for some color, if you could describe what it was like living in Huron and waking up and seeing buildings being torn down.
I don't want to go there.
One of the most contentious parcels in the urban renewal project was the Town Hall block. Built in 1876, It had been part of the urban renewal project from the very beginning. The city planned to demolish the old building, which was falling apart, and build a new City Hall complex. When the plans for urban renewal were first announced, Huron resident Mrs. Barbara Taylor began a campaign to save the town hall. In April of 1969, she asked a Cleveland architect to look at the building to see if it was worth restoring and if it could fit into Huron's urban renewal plans. After examining the building, he told her that the town hall could be restored, and it would be nice to keep something of the old downtown. The issue was finally put to the voters in May of 1973. The vote for a $352,000 bond issue to remodel the town hall was soundly defeated, 1,192 to 394. But the vote to build a new city complex was also defeated, 904 to 761. In February of the following year, City Council determined the fate of the old town hall when it announced that it would build a new complex to house city offices. A news release from the city stated that the decision was based on urban renewal needs, city government demands, and not upon efforts to build monuments.
Everybody loved the town hall, but it wasn't a functional building. There again, we were like the merchants. We had a building that was basically dilapidated and didn't meet the needs of the city. If you remember, the police station back then was out behind City Hall, and it was probably, 20 by 30 foot building, which then housed the police department, which also had a jail inside of it. The fire department was having growing pains. The rescue squad, etc., used to be run out of the local funeral home. It was sort of the growth of becoming from a village to a city. And when you come to a city, you got to start providing fire protection. It was all volunteer. So you had to build a fire station, you had to build a police station, and the old City Hall was sacrificed for the growth of the new, which is not a very attractive building.
Now, it was a nice old building, but it just wasn't efficient. They always said there were rats in the basement. I believe that because a lot of the records had been chewed, and it was kind of a dungeon down there.
I think we made one huge mistake, and how that came about, I don't know. The township owned the old township building, and the city had offices there. And the question was raised: Can we keep this old building? Well, those of you that know that place know that it was a beautiful, beautiful old building, but it wasn't really usable because to go, you had to, upstairs was the auditorium, and you had to climb, and people don't climb stairs anymore. We had competent architects in to look at it, and they said that the preservation of it wasn't worth doing. I think if we were to do it over again, we would do whatever it took to maintain that building.
The old City Halls, had character about it. And whether you went upstairs and just sat in the playhouse up there and thought about what happened in front of you or what didn't happen or what nobody knows about. But, it had that character, and we don't have that anymore.
I recall when they started tearing down the old city building. I was taking pictures, of course, but I went inside for one last look, and they didn't know I went in. They knocked that wrecking ball against the roof. I could hear it, but that old building did not move. It didn't creak. They had to do it a long time before things started falling down. Of course, I got out of there right away. I knew they were starting, but I was still in there when they hit the first time.
City officials were stunned when the results of the November 4th, 1969 election were counted. The four incumbents running for re-election, Mayor Pat Joffrey, Arthur Strome, Richard Malone, and DeWitt Owen, were defeated. Elected in their places were John McGraw, Pete Walderzak, Rollin Jackson, and vocal urban renewal opponent Millicent Lieb. The new council was sworn in on December 1st, 1969. Minutes after Frank Loritz was sworn in as vice mayor and Dean Sheldon as clerk of the council, Sheldon shocked the standing room only audience by reading his letter of resignation. When asked after the meeting why he was resigning, he would only say, "I've had enough." He had no immediate plans for the future.
When did you leave?
1970, in April. Well, they had an election, and they, at that time, we had instituted an income tax, which we desperately needed to maintain this growing urban community. And people objected to that. There was quite a group of people that were opposed to that. And I think they, for lack of a better description, threw the rascals out. They weren't rascals. They were the people that had responded in a most positive fashion to the request of the Chamber of Commerce for this particular project.
I think getting 4 new people on council in 1969, the manager was going to have a rough way to go, because you have to have a council that supports you, and you serve at the pleasure of council. You don't have a contract. So I believe that he thought it wasn't worth the hassle anymore.
I really don't know what happened after I left, but I do know that the enthusiasm for carrying out the project did not wane, but it wasn't done exactly the same way that we would have done it. And I don't say that critically, I just think that's a fact.
What happened to the building plans?
The building,
Big complex that, you know,
the
supposed to go up.
The plans were originally, the boat basin in its first plan was round, and the second plan, it was horseshoe. And they had businesses on the outskirts of that, surrounding it. And when it came time to do some building, the interest rates were 15% or better. And the developers that were interested kind of backed out and decided they did not want to invest at that time. And then the basin sat idle for a long time, and it was an open space, and people liked that. And they didn't want any buildings built down there then. They wanted more of a focal center for communities, like a community gathering area. And that's why you don't see many buildings down there. There's just a few on the south side, but the rest is all kind of open. And it's become more of a destination for different functions, and it's used quite a bit in the summertime. But the reason the plans didn't happen was because of that, the economy at the time.
In October 1979, 10 years after the first building was demolished, the City Council signed a contract with Bob and Joan Trock's Huron River Development Corporation. The Huron-based company built the 12-unit Clipper Ship Cove apartments across from the Presbyterian Church for local businessman Bob Reynolds and his two partners. Trock then built several two-story condos on the west side of the boat basin and named the complex Anchor Point. Trock owned the retail stores on the first floor, and Reynolds owned the residential apartments on the second floor. One by one, the retail stores were forced out because of a lack of customers. According to Bob Trock, this was due to the low traffic count on Main Street and the struggling national economy. After developing two parcels, the city insisted the Trocks buy and develop a third. Because Anchor Point had vacant storefronts, the company was unable to rent, and the economy had yet to recover. The Trocks were unable to buy the parcel. The city canceled their contract and began looking for another developer. In June 1986, City Council was presented with several proposals for the urban renewal parcel located next to the existing Anchor Point buildings. Council gave the contract to Cleveland area businessman Forrest Roberts of Huron River Properties, who had big plans to build a $2.7 million boat showroom with condominiums, a restaurant, a small boat marina, and memorial amphitheater. Roberts completed phase 1 of his project, but couldn't secure the financing to finish the rest. Local optometrist Dr. David Dreffer, along with 3 partners, formed Southport Limited. They embarked on an ambitious $7.5 million project to develop the north end of the boat basin. The project would create 5 buildings that included condominiums, retail office space, and parking. However, the finances fell through and the city purchased the property back. The city then sold Dr. Dreffer a smaller lot between Williams and Main Street to put up his office building.
In the mid-70s, of course, when the land was ready for selling, redeveloping, the interest market went to hell. So the financial world went to hell. The interest rates on CDs were paying 10 to 16%. So people invested their money in CDs and not in building new buildings. We had a couple of local developers. One were previous owners of downtown, which was the Stips, the Rows, etc., that presented a program, and for some reason or another, it was met with a lot of negativity on council. We had some big developers in from Cleveland who presented big plans. And when it all came down to choosing who this developer was going to be, the balance of the city council at that particular time chose the Trock proposal, which sort of set the theme for what was going to be down there.
When the builder, Bob Trock, was awarded the contract to build around the boat basin, the numbers didn't work out. The cost of developing the unusual site did not create enough rental and or sales to pay for the project. So we stepped forward to build the residential building, which is Clipper Ship Cove, and then all the second floor units, with the exception of the one over the flower shop, we owned. So we developed 5 condominiums above the residential or the commercial property, and that created better numbers, and it made the project go for Bob Trock.
We started having vacancies on the commercial property. Again, the people couldn't maintain an income to keep the properties, and there were 4 bankruptcies over the first 5 years. in there where people couldn't afford to stay. So it wasn't really a viable property. We had to reinvent the use of the property, and basically we ended up with the first floors, for the most part, were office areas rather than commercial areas.
I have a question. Part of government's function is to create a climate in which business can grow and thrive. Do you think that Huron government did that?
Not at all. No. We were on our own the entire way. After we gave them our 17,000 plus whatever our deposit was, that was it.
There were some of the councilmen did not want to see residential in the area. And I could understand that, being an appraiser, but you have to have a mix. And when you put residential into an area, they demand services, and that brings the retail back in line. And many of the communities, such as Sandusky now, they're experiencing this. You have to get the people there, and then they'll demand services. You can't put the services there and then tell the people to move downtown because we have a drugstore there. Well, they have one in the next town and the next block too. So you really have to try to balance it. And I think we created a balance. Not everybody was happy with residential, but it is an ingredient to success.
In retrospect, the city father's original concept of having one guy do everything and coordinate it would have been the best thing. But they couldn't do that. The next best thing is to sell it off in parcels, which after 3 or 4 years they did. But evidently they didn't have enough teeth in the architectural review committee in order to really make sure that they followed along.
I think we all lived in a dream world. We thought what we saw on plans was a realistic approach to what the town could be. Where you see the amphitheater down there, that was intended to be all retail on different levels. Main Street was meant to be just a parking artery, and William Street was to be the main street going through town. The Druffer and Williamson Professional Building was not supposed to be there. That plan was changed. The Twine House was supposed to expand and go into the convention center. That never happened. And the main reason was money, and the interest rates to borrow money wasn't there for the development.
I think that we laid the groundwork for the downtown, which I am pleased, very proud that we did do. And I do think that the people now that have the powers are helping the businesses. I know at the boat basin and through the Chamber of Commerce that they are recognizing businesses, and they know that they have to help if they want them to stay.
But it's interesting hearing people come up to you later on in life and say, boy, Millicent was really right. But, everyone would say it was her presentation, and other people would say, no, she never was right. But I think the majority of what I've heard in the last few years has been, really, Millie was right. And it's sad that we've lost a downtown. It was really nice.
And as I look back on the project, and it was a very controversial project, I can see where had urban renewal not existed and had they continued to occupy the resident or the commercial properties in the downtown area, that as we look at it now, they probably would be all vacant. And with the advent of the mall and strip shopping centers and that sort of thing, the little downtowns are just part of history. However, we are very, very lucky, very fortunate. We have the boat basin, and it's become a community center. It's become certainly a centerpiece of the community. And whereas without urban renewal, we wouldn't have had it. So in the long run, at this point in time, I think the complex or the urban renewal program was the right way to go. It just took longer to get there.
Is it a better place today? it's probably not as friendly as it used to be, and that could just be people. It used to be a real friendly place to go on a Saturday morning. You'd see everybody and you'd chat and you'd shop and what have you. But on the whole, I think it's probably better off today. People after the fact says, yes, I would have, redone my building. I would have made it safe. I would have done the rewiring and stuff that was necessary and make it appreciable. But if you drive down Bellevue, Ohio, or you go to Milan even, there's a lot of empty storefronts, and there's a lot of buildings that are becoming dilapidated, as obvious in the city of Sandusky. So what does it take? Back then it was a dream, it didn't happen. But what we have now, and we see that boat basin full every weekend, we see dances, we see music, we see different things happening. So in a certain degree, it is a success.
When do you think urban renewal was done? When do you think this project was completed?
Actually and technically, we are still operating under the rules of urban renewal. If anybody wants to do something downtown, we still have to go back and make sure it's under the urban renewal rules. So I think we're still doing it. As far as the rules go, I think the project was completed basically when the boat basin opened and people started using the downtown area. But really, we're still going on with it today, in one sense.
I think it was, I thought it was planned well. The chaotic part came in them trying to decide how they were going to develop the land. And they spent a lot of time trying to entice different groups of people to come in that would take down the whole parcel.
Did you think urban renewal was a good idea?
In hindsight, no. But at the time, emotion overtook my business sense. I wanted it to happen. I wanted the town to be rebuilt as a local resident.
Although urban renewal gutted the downtown and never let it come back, the character of Huron residentially is really stayed quite wonderful. It's a great bedroom community for all things except commercial. There's just no town, and that's what I think we miss the most.
Today, I would guess, given the penchant in urban America for preservation and restoration of older sites, we might have taken a different approach. I think it's incredible that we were able to do this here, and at the same time improve municipal services and the whole climate for life here in this town. I look at Huron now, almost 50 years later, and as far as I know from talking to people around, this is where people want to come, this is where they want to live, this is where they want to send their kids to school. Sure, there are always problems when it comes to differing points of view with how you operate schools and governments, but all I do is look around and see what the climate is here, and it looks to me like we started out pretty well and it's continued. I'm enormously proud of this town, and I think they made a good decision 50 years ago, and I think it's paid big dividends to them.